Sister banned me from her wedding because her fiancé was too nice to me. Hi everyone. My name is Sophia, 24F. And I'm here because I need your perspective on something that's completely upended my family dynamic. I have an older sister, Emily, 29F, who was supposed to get married to James, 29M. They seemed like the perfect couple, together for years, seemingly in love, and planning what everyone thought would be a dream wedding. But things took a bizarre turn, and now the wedding is off. The reason? James called off the wedding because he thinks Emily was cruel for banning me from attending. And the cherry on top, Emily is convinced James is in love with me. I know how absurd that sounds, but let me explain. To give you some context, I'm not particularly close to Emily or my parents. There's no dramatic fallout or event that caused this. We just naturally drifted apart. After I went to college, I barely came home, preferring to spend spring breaks traveling or visiting my grandparents. It was easier than dealing with the awkwardness that came with being home. My parents and Emily are very different from me. They've always had their own little bubble that I've never quite fit into. Growing up, I felt like an outsider in my own family. They'd bond over things I couldn't relate to, and any time I brought up my own interests, it was like speaking a foreign language. They'd nod politely, maybe offer a short comment, then shift the conversation back to what interested them. Eventually, I stopped trying. But what hurt the most was how little they seemed to care when I started pulling away. They didn't make an effort to reach out or check in on me. It felt like they were perfectly fine with the distance, even happy to have me out of their lives. That realization stung. Family is supposed to notice when one of their own is drifting away, right? But they didn't. Over time, my visits home became fewer and fewer. I'd come back for major holidays, birthdays, and family celebrations, but even then, I felt more like a guest than part of the family. Conversations were polite but shallow. No real warmth or connection. Emily and I never had the kind of close bond many siblings share. She's always been the golden child. The one who followed the rules, lived up to my parents' expectations, and fit perfectly into their world. Meanwhile, I was the odd one out, the black sheep. It wasn't that my family was overtly cruel, but they had a knack for subtle put-downs. Little comments that seemed harmless on the surface but hit deeper than they realized. Eventually, I decided it was better to minimize contact. Why put myself in situations where I felt out of place? Last Christmas, James joined us for dinner, and for the first time in ages, I didn't feel completely invisible. My family has this way of making me feel like an outsider, but James treated me like a normal human being. He asked about my life, laughed at my jokes, and genuinely seemed interested in what I had to say. It was refreshing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I figured James was just being kind, but for some reason, his friendliness really seemed to bother Emily. Throughout dinner, Emily kept shooting me icy glares, but I brushed it off. Later that night, she confronted me. She pulled me aside and said, "I know what you're doing. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're trying to steal my fiancé." I was stunned. "What? Steal your fiancé? What are you talking about?" I asked, laughing nervously, thinking she had to be joking. But Emily wasn't joking. She accused me of being too friendly with James, and said I was trying to get his attention. I was floored. All we'd done was chat about normal things, travel, work, school. There was nothing remotely inappropriate about our conversation. Emily has always been the center of attention, the perfect one in our family, so I chalked her outburst up to insecurity or paranoia. I tried to brush it off, but things only got worse after that night. After that confrontation, Emily became even colder toward me. She started avoiding me altogether. At family gatherings, she'd stick to James's side like glue, almost as if she were marking her territory. It was ridiculous. James, on the other hand, continued acting the same, polite, friendly, and normal around me. What really got under my skin was how quickly the rest of my family seemed to take Emily's side. Nobody said anything outright, but there were little signs. My mom started giving me odd looks whenever Emily and James were around. My dad, who's usually neutral, began making pointed comments about how important it is to respect family relationships. Everything was subtle but unmistakable. They were all buying into Emily's narrative. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. My family was treating me as if I were some kind of threat to Emily's relationship, which was ridiculous. I've never been one to get involved in other people's drama, let alone my sister's. We barely talked outside of family gatherings, so why would I suddenly be interested in her fiancé? It made no sense. A few months later, I found out from my grandparents that Emily was engaged. Yep, my own sister didn't even bother to tell me herself. At this point, I wasn't expecting her to send me a glitter-filled, heart-covered invitation or anything, but finding out from my grandparents felt like a punch to the gut. It confirmed everything I'd already suspected about how little my family cared about me. I guess a small part of me had been holding on to the hope that, despite our differences, Emily would still consider me part of her life during such a major event. After all, we're sisters, right? But no, clearly that was too much to ask. At first, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just busy with wedding planning. Maybe it slipped her mind to call me. But as days turned into weeks with no word from her, it became clear she wasn't going to reach out. Then out of the blue, Emily called me. I was genuinely surprised to see her name pop up on my phone, especially since we hadn't spoken since her bizarre accusation at Christmas. I answered, trying to act casual, but after a few awkward minutes of small talk, she dropped the bombshell. "I'm not inviting you to the wedding." I was silent for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. It's not like I was eagerly awaiting an invitation, but hearing her say it out loud still hurt. When I asked why, she hit me with the most absurd reason. "Since James has feelings for you, I don't want you there. It'll just be awkward." I couldn't help but laugh out loud. "James has feelings for me? Are you serious?" I asked. It was so absurd that I didn't even have the energy to argue. "Have a great wedding and a happy marriage," I said before hanging up. I didn't need that drama in my life, and honestly, we weren't close enough for me to care about being part of her big day. I'd already accepted that Emily and I lived in two completely different worlds, so I brushed it off and moved on. Or so I thought. Yesterday, I was having a perfectly normal day when I got a frantic call from my dad. "Sophia, you need to come down to the venue right now," he said. No explanation, no details, just an urgent demand for me to drop everything and show up. Naturally, I was confused and asked what was going on, but he refused to tell me anything, just kept repeating, "You need to come immediately." I wasn't feeling particularly generous with my time or patience. This was the same family that had excluded me from the wedding and treated me like an outsider. So I told him, "I'm not coming just because you're demanding it," and hung up. Not even 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Emily. I reluctantly picked up, already bracing myself for more drama. What she said next, though, completely floored me. James had called off the wedding. Apparently, he'd had enough of Emily's cruel and controlling behavior, and the way she and my parents treated me was the final straw. He refused to marry her. Honestly, I was impressed. It takes a lot of guts to walk away like that, especially so close to the wedding. But of course, Emily wasn't calling to apologize. Instead, she had the audacity to ask me for a favor. She wanted me to come to the rehearsal dinner, or what was left of it, and pretend that everything was fine. She wanted me to lie and say I had chosen not to attend the wedding, rather than admitting she had banned me. She was trying to salvage her image, and I was supposed to help her do it. I couldn't believe the nerve of this woman. After accusing me of trying to steal her fiancé, excluding me from the wedding, and treating me like garbage, she now expected me to swoop in and save the day? The sheer delusion was mind-blowing. "You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to do that," I told her flatly. I could practically hear her jaw hit the floor through the phone. She tried to argue, but I wasn't interested. I hung up, put my phone on silent, and went to bed like a baby. James calling off the wedding felt like the ultimate karmic justice. I don't know all the details of why he finally snapped, but I have a pretty good idea. Emily and my parents have always been controlling and manipulative. They never consider how their actions affect others, they only care about their egos. I guess James finally saw through it all. What really gets me, though, is how quickly Emily and my parents turned to me for help once everything started falling apart. It's funny how I suddenly became important to them when they needed someone to clean up their mess. Too bad for them. I'm done being their scapegoat. They didn't care about me when they were busy planning their perfect wedding. But the moment everything fell apart, suddenly I became important. Yeah, no thanks. This morning was unreal. I woke up to 117 missed calls, and over 200 messages from my family. Yes, you read that right. Over 100 missed calls. My phone was blowing up from the moment I opened my eyes. Seeing all those notifications made my stomach drop. It was an anxiety-inducing way to start the day, to say the least. Most of the calls were from my parents and Emily. I ignored them all. I wasn't about to dive into that mess first thing in the morning. Instead, I tried to start my day as normally as possible because honestly, who wants to deal with family drama before coffee? After ignoring the chaos for a while, I started to feel a little guilty. I decided to call my grandparents, the only ones in my family I genuinely trust. I figured they could give me the lowdown without the added drama. As soon as my grandma picked up, I could hear the tension in her voice. She told me that Emily had been crying nonstop since last night. Apparently, James was refusing to speak to her or even entertain a conversation. He had completely cut her off and gone MIA. Emily was devastated, and my parents were in full-blown panic mode, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Then my grandma gently suggested, "Maybe you should reach out to James to clear up any misunderstandings." I nearly laughed. What misunderstandings? James made his decision, and it had nothing to do with me. Still, I understood where my grandparents were coming from. I love them and hate seeing them stressed out. Part of me thought, if talking to James will get everyone off my back, maybe it's worth it. But the bigger part of me was just so over being dragged into this mess. Just as I was trying to clear my head, my doorbell rang. I checked the peephole and couldn't believe my eyes. It was my entire family. My parents, Emily, and even James were all standing there like they were staging some kind of intervention. I wasn't about to let them into my personal space, especially after everything that had gone down. I stepped outside, shut the door behind me, and told them they could say whatever they needed to say right there on the porch. Emily wasted no time. She immediately launched into her, "You need to fix this routine," demanding that I explain everything to James to smooth things over. She essentially wanted me to clean up her mess and magically make everything okay. I stood there, staring at her in disbelief. Then I realized, no, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to lie for her or twist the truth to make her look better. She had caused this mess and she needed to own up to it. I turned to James and laid everything out. I told him the truth, that Emily had accused me of trying to steal him, that she banned me from the wedding because she thought he had feelings for me, and that this kind of behavior wasn't new. I explained that my family had been manipulative, toxic, and downright mean to me for as long as I could remember. James stood there quietly listening. I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed everything I was saying. Out of nowhere, Emily snapped. She slapped me. Yes, a full-on open-handed slap across the face. I was shocked. My first instinct was to slap her right back. I mean, after years of her nonsense, this was the last straw. But before I could react, James stepped in. He grabbed Emily by the arm and pulled her aside. They started talking in hushed tones, and while I couldn't hear everything, it was clear things were escalating. A few minutes later, Emily came back, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me, my parents, and James before saying, "It's over. The engagement is officially over." James had broken things off for good. He told her they shouldn't see each other anymore and walked away. Just like that, he was gone. Emily stood there sobbing, and as much as I've never gotten along with her, I felt a pang of sympathy. No one deserves to have their engagement end like that, no matter how much they've hurt others. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore that this was a direct result of her own actions. She had pushed James to his breaking point, just like she'd pushed me so many times before. As I stood there on my porch, Emily crying, my parents glaring at me like I was the villain, I realized they were blaming me for all of this. It was like they thought I had caused the breakup, not Emily's behavior. I didn't know what to say, and honestly, I didn't want to be there any longer. I mumbled something about needing to go inside, turned around, and shut the door behind me. Once inside, I sat down and tried to process everything. It felt like a scene from a soap opera, but this was my real life. Update. A lot of you have asked about why I've been distant from my family for so long. Honestly, I didn't go into it in my original post because it's a long story, but maybe now's a good time to unpack it. Growing up, I always felt different from my family. I have social anxiety, which made me feel out of place, but my parents never took it seriously. They were old school and believed mental health issues were just excuses. Anytime I expressed my struggles, they dismissed me with comments like, "You're just being dramatic," or, "You need to toughen up." Being ignored and misunderstood became the norm for me, which is why I started pulling away in the first place. Now, seeing how quickly they turned on me during this wedding fiasco, I know I made the right decision to keep my distance. Growing up with social anxiety was hard enough, but my family made it worse. If I was visibly anxious or having a panic attack, they'd call me weak or lazy, like I was choosing to feel that way. My entire childhood felt like I was being punished for something I couldn't control. Emily wasn't just the golden child at home. She was popular at school, too. She always had a big group of friends who acted like they were better than everyone else. I remember one night when I was 15, Emily invited her friends over for a sleepover. I walked into the kitchen to grab a snack, and the room went silent. Then they started giggling. Emily smirked and said, "Oh look, it's our little hermit. She doesn't even know how to talk to people." It might sound small, but that kind of teasing was constant. Being mocked by my sister and her friends hurt. But what hurt more was how my parents never stood up for me. They'd either laugh along or brush it off, saying, "They're just having fun." High school only made things worse. I vividly remember the day I had to give a big presentation in English class. For someone with social anxiety, standing in front of a room full of classmates was my worst nightmare. I barely slept the night before and was physically sick with anxiety the morning of. When I told my parents how I was feeling, they dismissed me. "It's just a presentation, Sophia. Stop making a big deal out of everything." I ended up stumbling through the presentation while the class laughed. When I got home crying, their response was the same. "You're overreacting." By the time I left for college, I was mentally drained. I knew I needed help but felt ashamed to seek it, because my family had conditioned me to believe that needing help was a weakness. It wasn't until I started seeing a campus counselor that I realized my struggles weren't just in my head. Getting diagnosed with social anxiety disorder was a turning point for me. It meant that what I was feeling wasn't imaginary or dramatic. It was real. Therapy helped me learn coping mechanisms, handle panic attacks, and most importantly, set boundaries. I realized that being around my family was a major trigger, so I started pulling away. At first, I felt guilty, but prioritizing my mental health was the best decision I ever made. Of course, my family saw it differently. To them, I was selfish and ungrateful. They never once asked why I was distancing myself or if I was okay. They just accused me of being dramatic, like always. Emily, naturally, took every chance she could to make snide comments whenever I came home. "Too good for the family now, huh?" she'd say. Over time, I stopped visiting altogether, and while it wasn't easy, it was necessary. The drama with Emily and James only confirmed what I'd always known. Emily hadn't changed. Her behavior during the wedding debacle proved that she was still the same manipulative, toxic person she'd always been. And my parents, they were just as enabling as ever. Since the breakup, Emily's been channeling all her anger toward me. It started small, like leaking my phone number to random people, which led to endless texts and calls from strangers. But then she escalated. She started egging my house. Yes, my 29-year-old sister was throwing eggs at my house like a teenager pulling a prank. At first, I ignored it, hoping she'd get bored and move on. But after the second time, I was done. I called my parents, hoping they'd step in and talk some sense into her. Their response? "It's between you two girls. Work it out yourselves." Realizing I was on my own, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called Emily directly and told her that if she egged my house again, I'd file a police report. Vandalism is vandalism, no matter who's doing it. Her reaction was exactly what I expected. A tirade of insults and accusations. She called me dramatic and selfish, as if I was the one in the wrong. I hung up, feeling both relieved and frustrated. It was exhausting to deal with her, but at least I'd made my point clear. Surprisingly, she hasn't bothered me since. Maybe the threat of police scared her, or maybe she's just too busy planning her next move. Either way, I'm grateful for the peace. Looking back, I've come to terms with the fact that my relationship with my family will never be what I wish it could be. I keep them at arm's length because every time I let them in, they hurt me. My parents still don't acknowledge my anxiety, and Emily is as self-absorbed as ever. I wish things were different, but I've learned to prioritize my own well-being, and that's what matters most. Cutting them off doesn't mean I don't care. It means I care enough about myself to protect my peace.